Hello everybody, it's Merlin here, and today we're going to be discussing a rather interesting topic someone requested, and that was how to get into X-Men. What I did was I basically wrote down a couple suggestions that I would give someone if they were thinking about getting into X-Men comics, because I'll be honest, the comic book industry, I find it interesting because a lot of the people that I deal with on my channel are primarily anime and manga fans, which is nice because for them they can just pick up a series from the beginning, and it's usually chronological, and they can just keep going. And if it's not super long, like One Piece or something, they can catch up pretty quickly. But if it's superhero comics in America with the constantly shifting, writers and artists and different crossovers and parallel dimensions, and sometimes just rebooting the series and starting over again, this is primarily a DC problem. It can be kind of difficult. But at the same time, I find it kind of interesting because as difficult as some people seem to think it is, that most comics and most trades, if you want to purchase the graphic novel collections, they'll have like a little intro summary of the character, how they got their powers, and what's been going on with them lately. So usually you don't go in totally blind. I mean, you might not know a whole lot about the characters to begin with, but basically what I can say is getting into comics in general, you really just have to dive in and just start reading consistently, and then you'll get a sense for the characters and the world. But X-Men in particular, though, is probably the most difficult to get into because unlike DC and unlike Marvel in general, Marvel does keep their same chronology for the most part, but no series is more dedicated to their own history and little details from storylines and characters decades beforehand than the X-Men comics. So here are a couple suggestions. You could start from the beginning. You could actually go back to the original Stan Lee storylines with the original 5 X-Men, and that could actually work out pretty consistently for you. I read some of them. They're fun, they're simple, but it's a really good way to get a good sense of the characters and where they started. And then if you get an idea of that, then you could jump into some more modern storylines. Then there's just diving into a couple classic storylines from the Chris Claremont era. Now, if you ask anybody who's an X-Men fan, especially a season one, then that's the best place to start because Chris Claremont is kind of unofficially the X-Men writer. I mean, I know Stan Lee created the characters, but generally the way we think of X-Men now, like a lot of you that grew up with the X-Men animated series or even X-Men Evolution or Wolverine the X-Men, a lot of that's originated from the Chris Claremont days, and with 2 storylines in particular. You have the Days of Future Past, which was recently adapted into a big budget movie. Some of you guys are somewhat familiar with that. And then there's the Dark Phoenix saga. Now, those 2 sagas are admittedly based on knowing the characters, but they're also fairly self-contained storylines. Like Days of Future Past, you can get a sense of the world and the danger and the conflict because they're giving you so much more about this alternate timeline. You don't need to know a whole lot about the X-Men beforehand. And with the Dark Phoenix saga, they're introducing you to some new alien worlds, so you don't necessarily have to know the characters as much. So really, Chris Claremont's the best way to get into classic X-Men. Check out those storylines and some of the other ones he did, because those are some of the most iconic X-Men storylines ever. I'm also going to give you a couple personal suggestions. Now, next to Stan Lee and next to Chris Claremont, the best X-Men writer that I've ever experienced in the traditional X-Men storylines would be Joss Whedon. Now, you guys know Joss Whedon, The Avengers, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Firefly. The guy's a great writer, known for his snappy dialogue and some really good human tales, but also an air for the fantastical. His Unstoppable storyline and everything around it was really, really awesome. I recommend it. If you're a fan of Joss Whedon or any of his work, that could be a great way for you to get introduced into the classic storylines because a lot of them actually complement the Chris Claremont storylines. So reading the Claremont stuff and then even skipping decades ahead to the Whedon stuff, there's a lot of callbacks. So that's a good two-way piece to do that if you like to do it that way. You could also go into the Ultimate X-Men, and the good thing about that is, much like Ultimate Spider-Man and the other Ultimate lines, it kind of rebooted the entire series to make it more modern and start it fresh without having to have people go back and read the old comic books, making it less corny, more relatable, darker, more complicated. And the X-Men, Ultimate X-Men, from what I've read of it, is actually very good. It's definitely not 100% traditionally X-Men. There are some differences, but the core is still there, and it's also much more self-contained and easier to follow. So if you want a good introduction to X-Men, check out the Ultimate series. Also, I'm going to have to recommend one of my favorite comic book stories of all time, one of my favorite comic book lines, New X-Men. Now, you might be thinking, why would you want to recommend a spin-off series to get into X-Men in general? Well, the good thing about getting into New X-Men is much like the students themselves, you feel like you're completely new to the world, so you're getting introduced to all these concepts because it follows these new students who are being taught by the X-Men. So you get to know Emma Frost, Wolverine, Beast, Jean Grey, Cyclops. You get to know all these different characters who are their teachers, and you get to see these experiences through their eyes. Plus, it has some really great characters and some really good storylines as well. I'd really recommend New X-Men too if you just want to get started to learning more about the X-Men universe. Now, since we've talked about the meat of the comics, if you're afraid of getting into the comics directly, well, there's a couple other things you can do. You can get into it through the movies. If you have not seen the X-Men movies that were done by Bryan Singer, then you can check them out. Honestly, there's some really good ways to encapsulate a lot of the good X-Men storylines. Now, some purists might be like, oh, you know, there's problems, which there are, but within its own self-contained universe, it's a good way to get started. But even better than the movies, if you really want to get a good idea of the X-Men before you go into the comics, you can check out some of the animated series. Now, the best one for sure, believe it or not, is the X-Men animated series from the 90s. Because not only was it the longest running, it also really focused on a lot of the classic X-Men storylines from the beginning of the X-Men up to the 90s. So really, pretty much every major event is covered from the comics and faithfully. The characters are all done faithfully as well, and it's how I got introduced to X-Men when I was a kid, long before I read the comics. Plus, I would say X-Men Evolution is another good way to do it if you want to look at it from a younger perspective, and Wolverine and the X-Men is not a bad way to start it as well. Well, guys, those are the best ways I can recommend getting into X-Men or X-Men comics. Let me know if you have any other suggestions, and if you have any requests for future videos, feel free to let me know. Alright, guys. See ya.